Welcome to Reddit Aliens. Serious, scientists of Reddit. What is something that you believe to be true in your field of study, but you don't have the evidence to prove it? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Mine is in my field of cancer. Often patients treated for their cancer may have no evidence of remaining cancer treatment completion. A not uncommon event is the cancer returns years later. The common belief is there are hidden cancer cells remaining in the body, maybe just single cells here and there that we can't detect. Then they grow and the cancer returns after a few years with detectable tumors. The glaring problem with this theory is the time. For many of these cancers, they are rapidly dividing cells. Some cancers grow more slow, not talking about those, although this may apply. If they were missed, it should not take 4 years or even 2 years for evidence of the cancer return to be detected. This just does not make sense, given rapid cancer cell growth, which had already spread around the body, metastasized. For decades, I've held an alternative theory, which I did not work on as part of my research due to where I worked and resources needed to do something pretty complex and expensive, and that is many of these patients are in fact cancer-free, and they're not hidden cancer cells. What might still exist after treatment are the precancerous cells that over a couple-year period developed into cancer again. That is the simple answer. Here's a bit more complex. Cancer is not a single gene mutation event or caused by a virus alone. Multiple key genes need to be mutated or virus infected with subsequent gene mutations to get what we call cancer. That cancer is derived from a pool of precancerous cells, many of which we cannot identify or very easily identify in the patient. One cell out of the pool will get the last key mutation, then that single cell grows into a tumor. So say a tumor is 100% surgically removed. You may not see the surrounding precancerous cells as they may be visibly look normal and thus not removed. As mentioned, cancer involves multiple gene mutations, let's say 4 key genes. It actually varies for different types for simplicity. Those precancerous cells we can't see may have 3 or 4 needed. Now here's the thing, it takes time to acquire that extra mutation because how it works, and a few years makes a lot of sense time-wise. My hunch is that these cancer reoccurrences years later from cancer-free patients are actually the cancer developing again from these primed cells, and not some individual cancer cell hidden in the body for years, then showing up as a tumor. The timing of it just makes a lot more sense. So why has this not been shown? At least to my knowledge, haven't been following that this closely of late. This is a hard experiment to do for a lot of reasons. You need to access to cancer patients and their tissue, and you need to be able to experiment on them ethically, which includes being sure you do not do additional harm to them beyond the cancer treatment. So many things you might need to do to prove this may not be ethically possible, as it could hurt the patient, and other things clearly would hurt the patient and cannot be done. Another issue is being able to identify these cells using molecular techniques while the tissue is in the patient. Very hard, and again, may cause harm, but these techniques may be required to identify precancerous cells which might be unidentifiable otherwise, then conclusively proving that the returning cancer came from this route, versus the kid-enhancer cell, can be very difficult. One might use a clever animal model to do this, which gives you access to all tissues whenever you need it, but this is not simple either. Mice are the easiest and cheapest models for this, but they only live about 2 years, which might not be long enough for something that takes maybe 4 years. Monkeys live longer, but your costs just skyrocketed from an already expensive experiment. Also, depending on the model, it may not actually really reflect what is going on in a patient. Always something I wished I was in a position to work on, but only really could contemplate the idea. As a former math and physics major, I took meticulous notes of my son's epileptic seizure. At one point, I added barometric readings and current weather data to standard information of date, seizure type, and seizure length in seconds. I'm convinced that low-pressure weather systems increase the frequency and intensity of his epileptic seizures. During a trip to North Carolina, the area had an unusually high, stable high-pressure system. He didn't have any seizures during our time there. My theory is that high or low pressure weather systems microscopically change the flow of fluids in the brain or other neurologically sensitive areas of the body, such as the microbiome of the gut. Gut bacteria has evolved to influence our behaviors, either directly or indirectly, to crave foods that benefit it. That's why it's hard to come off certain foods. Anecdotally, it's hard to give up high sugar, high fat foods, yet if you go for long enough without them, your desire for them drops massively. I believe it's because the gut flora that likes that food dies off and no longer influences your behavior. It's very, very hard to prove, but it seems self-evident that if bacteria even had the slightest opportunity to evolve a means to do this, it would almost be a certainty. That UHT pasteurization of liquid food products leaves a barely perceptible aftertaste that only a small segment of the consumer population can detect. Far more neurological processes are prion-influenced than previously thought, and prion therapy will be the next major breakthrough sometime in the 2030s. Good to know. Environmental geologist. That there's a huge amount of environmental contamination, soil, water, air, in residential areas, and rapid development is only making the problem worse. Most people in populated areas are likely very, very close to known sites with dangerous contamination, and the number of unknown sites dwarfs what's been addressed. On top of that, in the USA, low-income housing projects don't need to meet as stringent environmental regulations, so a site that fails for normal residential use might still qualify for low-income housing. So the less fortunate are slightly more expendable and more at risk. So, seems like a few countries I know. The semi-classical theory of gravitation, put forth by Moeller and Rosenfeld in the 1960s and further refined by physicists since then, is an incorrect theory of quantum gravitation. It's seductive because it marries Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity, which we know is true for the large, with quantum mechanics, which we know is true for the small, in a very natural, intuitive way. To be fair, nobody believes it, I think, but so far, nobody has been able to rule it out either. I'm not sure if this really fits, but intergenerational trauma. We know that physical and psychological stress in one generation, whether it be war, rape, genocide, alcoholism, drug use, growing up in the system, I could go on forever, can pass on to the next generation. But we don't really know how. Heritable epigeniomic changes have been the first proposal, but no one has done this specific research. My supervisor demonstrated a change in mitochondrial DNA copy number, resulting in epigenomic changes in regions of the genome associated with disease. Epigenomic changes mean that the expression of the underlying genes can be altered. This can result in diseases. Usually, as a result of intergenerational trauma, people suffer more health repercussions, and no one could really explain why. I want to explain why on the genetic level. I think I'm on the right path, and I'm excited. Good luck. Digital communities have replicated the authority, structure, and meaning-making functions of religious communities without their physicality. As an early career ecologist, I suspect that the results of many experiments in my field would not stand up to replication. There's a huge bias towards positive results, those which support your hypothesis, and you are extremely disincentivized from research that is not seen as novel. This is doubly true for those of us without tenure yet, because we need to be seen as the cutting edge of our field to get a job in the first place. Meta-analysis help separate the signal from the noise a bit, but I suspect there's still a field-wide confirmation bias. The octane rating you see at the gas station, 87, 89, 91, etc., can vary in actuality much more than you or even the regulators think. There are so many factors that go into rating gasoline octane, and virtually every lab doesn't take them all into account, which creates massive variability. Even an EPA lab, where they verify the fuel is untrustworthy, I can promise you they are not considering all the factors they should be. And the reason they don't is because the allowable variability of gasoline octane is so large. You're not filling up with 87. You're probably filling up with 85.4 or 88.3. Remote sensing scientist here. We've probably reached the limit of EO spaceborne spectrometers and thermal imagery. Not enough energy at these wavelengths to increase image resolution at the far infrared and thermal channels. Maybe with machine learning and airborne imagery we can sharpen images, however, it'll be hard to use those products for any meaningful analysis. Cell biologist. We spend way too much money on cancer research and not enough on basic research, and have for decades. Despite that it's finally working, and the wave of immuno-oncology drugs that are in clinical testing now will significantly reduce deaths from cancer. We could have had this 30 years ago if we had spent a ton on basic research and not convinced ourselves we were about to beat cancer in the 70s. We might be fooling ourselves again. I've not been working on cancer directly for too long. Previously, though, it seemed like everyone was convinced we were about to cure cancer, then it fizzed. This time, it seems like few people expect cancer to be cured, despite real breakthroughs. Money. There are quite a few people who believe that there's a lot more money in the treatment than the cure, and that might really be the thing that's holding us back from curing something like cancer. What do you think? Astronomer here. You don't literally have infinite density or mass inside a black hole. I don't think anyone really thinks that. Instead, you have the laws of general relativity no longer work when you get a black hole where mass is compressed into such a tiny area. The devil is in the details, though, and no one knows how this alternative might work. The oceans are incredibly, catastrophically, incomprehensibly effed. We've been using the oceans at a high level for centuries, and our awareness of the impact of the oceans has come far too late. We just don't have enough data from before industrialization to understand what we've done. There's got to be a way to make pavement more frost resistant. Civil engineering background. I always thought it was the subsoil, since they check the density of the rest of the layers that make up the pavement. I live in pothole-infested state. Oh, you live in New York too? Melanism exists in mountain lions. I was driving and looked down a dirt road and saw a black animal run across it briefly. It was deer-sized, black like a black bear, and had a long tail, too big to be a dog. There's no recorded instance of melanistic mountain lions, but I want to start looking for them. The Crespi-Baddock hypothesis, that autism and schizophrenia are exactly opposite neurological divergences which develop epigenetically in the womb in response to entirely opposite environmental stressors, a world of excess and a world of scarcity, respectively, and therefore are never comorbid in the same individual. My extrapolation of the Crespi-Baddock is that autism spectrum disorder is really a first-world problem in the truest sense. It is rapidly increasing in the developed world, but not the developing world because compared to the environment in which humans evolved, today's first-world embryos receive a stream of resources and conditions indicating it will want for nothing. If the developing human does not anticipate needing the usually large amounts of brain resources devoted to reading other people in order to survive, this frees up these resources for understanding systems. Essentially, a person on the autism spectrum is a person whose developing brain received this consistent message that they can make it on their own without relying on many other people, and that their brain power is better devoted to understanding lots of different and new systems to great detail, so that they can make it on their own without relying on many other people. Schizophrenia, meanwhile, is largely a disease of the developing world and of urban slums worldwide. The brain that's able to become schizophrenic, meanwhile, receives a consistent message during development that it's entering a world of great scarcity and insecurity, and being attuned to other people and their needs and what they communicate will be absolutely indispensable to their survival. The kickstarting event for the first psychotic break is usually some sort of forceful rejection or other form of psychologically traumatic social interaction in the late teens or early 20s for men and 30s for women. Autistic patients miss messages from other people that are indeed there. Schizophrenic patients see messages from other people that aren't actually there. Hyposensitivity and hypersensitivity to social cues, respectively. Source: I'm an independent general practice physician with a strong interest in psychiatry and behavioral health, who is himself on the autism spectrum, and attracts largely patients who are on the autism spectrum. Treating students more like adults or people will cause them to begin to develop into adults more quickly. A lot of teachers that I've worked with or talked to treat students like a subclass of humans who are expected to give respect but not receive it. I treat my students like colleagues, and I end up getting a lot more output and learning from them. I have colleagues who shame them when they don't do what they think is right. When my students act like stupid kids, I tell them, of course you did it, you're kids. Kids act like stupid kids. And usually after those conversations, they start to act more like adults. I think it's because instead of shaming their behavior, I justify their behavior as a maturity and show them that if they grow in maturity, they'll be more deserving of the benefits of maturity. I mean, I know it's been quite a few years since I've been in any type of school setting, but being treated with the level of mutual respect usually got a better response, so I hope other teachers read this if they don't already practice that. Good advice. Cryosphere remote sensing. We've been seriously overestimating the volume of sea ice using radar altimeters. We pretend we know how thick the sea ice is because we think CS2 bounces off snow-ice interface, but that interface doesn't exist, and even if it did, the radar doesn't return from there. It just randomly bounces back from inhomogenites in the snowpack. Chemist here. If scientists got paid more and management types knew how to plan work more efficiently, we'd cure effing everything. But we aren't paid enough, and management doesn't care as long as they get paid to sit around. So bench scientists just fart around finishing projects here and there, sometimes making a mad dash at the last possible minute to get data for a deadline, but mostly just surfing the web and drinking coffee. There is no such thing as sustainable withdrawals from an aquifer to support commercial agriculture. Installing wells in some third world country, as people like to call them, to promote agriculture is just setting them up for a groundwater crisis 100 or so years from now, like the one the US is going to be dealing with soon. Northern HPA is doing okay because of high recharge zone, but central and southern HPA aren't looking so hot. COVID deaths are higher than most estimates due to shortening of lives by only a month or so in some people. While I do have a doctorate in applied physics, this comes from one of my other jobs, taking funerals. During a lockdown event, my group sees demand go up by about a factor of 3 versus normal background demand. That is expected. What is unexpected is that it falls to about 50% of background after lockdown, implying that about a quarter of the excess deaths were people who would have died within the next month. As I understand it, the year-on-year comparison usually used to estimate excess deaths from COVID is unlikely to show this short-term impact. Hence, I think that overall COVID death rates are probably underestimated by about a quarter. A few specifics. This is in the UK. Peak demand was about 40 funerals per month in our group. It is not great for physicists, but not out of place for small medical studies. I can't just ask what people died of. Most families don't know it was COVID, but the 3 times rise in funerals clearly shows most of them were due to COVID. That the language we speak, our native language, affects us from our culture to how we perceive the world, to how we make decisions and process information, and to possibly bring one of the factors that allows us to have and enjoy this higher level of consciousness. It even affected how our bodies form, larynx shaped differently than in other primates. While it makes us more susceptible to choking, it allows us to make the complex sounds needed in languages. However, there haven't been many studies on these topics because, for example, the topic of the origin of language and other scientific language topics on how it has affected us was banned by the leading scientific institutions in the 1600s and 1700s and was considered taboo because, for example, the topic of the origin and evolution of language was used in arguments on how the earth was older than the Bible made it out to be. It was considered taboo for a long time, and as late as the 1970s, these topics were just not to be discussed or researched. It was only in the 2000s that the first major studies started to be carried out, and today, because of this, it is still a relatively unexplored area, though this is starting to change.